Today we'll be completing modules 1 and 2 of the Databases and T-SQL course available on allison.com. So in the search bar, we're just going to type in database T-SQL to search for the course, and it'll be right here. So module 1 covers the core concepts concerning databases, especially in how they are written in the SQL or structured query language. And for this course, we'll be using the Microsoft SQL Server software to understand what are called relational databases. So this is covering both the database management system, DBMS, and the relational database management system, which is more about defining, creating, and querying and updating data that's stored in relational or interconnected databases. So again, the software we'll be using is the SQL Server Management Studio, or SSMS for short. It's essentially the interface in which we can manage the server, the SQL server, the relational databases, and then the content contained within these databases. So moving on to module 2, we'll understand the concepts of normalization, referential integrity, and we'll be able to recognize the constraints as part of referential integrity system. So this video covers the core concepts and methodologies behind the normalization process in databases. So essentially, 5 normalization forms are covered, the first 3 of which are considered primary methodologies. And all these methodologies do is essentially create new tables and establish relationships between each of the tables in reference to a key data, essentially. There are 2 other methodologies or normalization forms, but they generally do not affect the database functionality in most use cases. So really, this video only stresses the first 3. The first of which is eliminating repeating groups in databases, such as columns that are repeating in individual tables. And the second one, the second normal form, has to do with attributing what's called a foreign key between sets of data or sets of values. And each of these sets apply to essentially other sets of data, but they all are in reference to what's called the foreign key. So it's how the second normal form establishes essentially relationships between sets of data via a foreign key. Or it's also called a primary key. Different kinds of keys. The third normal form essentially um, eliminates types of data that are not directly dependent on the primary or the foreign key. So essentially, this normalization process cleans up, if you will, or arranges data such that it's more able to be utilized, essentially. And it has to be done, the normalization process is typically done in this sequential order via the normalization forms from the first to the second to the third form. So we will continue onwards to the next concept, constraints. More specifically, foreign key constraints in relational databases. So here I've basically delineated some of the concepts discussed in the video from the module. Basically, in order for databases to, in order for there to be a relationship established between databases, you have to use different keys available, or what are called constraints, to maintain referential integrity within the database system. And the database system includes multiple databases, of course, that are produced from unnormalized data, essentially, through the process of normalization. So the means by which that methodology is completed is using what's called a primary key, and it allows for there to be a uniqueness in database table, essentially, a unique identity, ID. And furthermore, you have something also a secondary constraint called foreign key. And the foreign key is usually dependent on the primary key. So there's a relationship between primary key and foreign key such that the foreign key can relate multiple databases to each other via a common primary key, essentially. So this is a methodology that we see again in what's called maintaining referential integrity in a database system, in a normalized database system. So when databases are database values, particular values in databases are looked up in SQL, there's a relationship, like I had just said, there's a relationship between the primary key and the foreign key, such that when that relationship is identified, the data itself can be verified in the system. So that's why they're used, essentially, for the referential integrity of the database system. So this diagram depicts a typical relational structure between, again, the primary key and the foreign key, essentially. There are some cases in which the foreign key does not necessarily reference a primary key, but in many cases it does. So to summarize, basically, a primary key is a unique ID that identifies each row in a database table, whereas a foreign key is typically more of column that relates multiple databases to each other in the system, again, for referential integrity purposes, so that all the information is the same across each database table in the system. So, with that being said, we will move on to the next slide. So essentially, this is just a summary of what I had already discussed regarding the concept or the idea of normalization, mainly that it's used to just understand information presented in a database more clearly and with accuracy and verification. And usually that's accomplished by establishing relationships between a series of database tables, all of which originate from one database source typically. And this methodology of normalizing databases is accomplished through the first three methods, as I had discussed. And the fourth and the fifth, again, are not completely necessary for many database designs, though they can be used later on to polish or further enhance an already efficient normalized methodology later on in a database design. So next slide. This just goes into more detail of the first three normalization forms. So again, when we disregard the fourth and the fifth normalization methods, the databases will still function and accomplish, there will still be relational integrity between the databases, but it could be perfected perhaps with the implementation of the fourth and the fifth normalization methods. With this idea called referential integrity, which involves the implementation and utilization of constraints, namely the primary key and the foreign key constraints, to ascertain accuracy between accurate data between database tables that have been normalized. And the word for it is synchronized, so that the tables are synchronized or the data between them is the same. And they're just further definitions of the same constraints. So this concludes modules 1 and 2 of the databases and T-SQL course.